Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Russ Linden, and I'm a longtime member of Congregation Beth Israel. We're delighted to see you and delighted that Dr. Sachs is here. He goes by Natan, but I want to start with his title. A couple of announcements, and then I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Caroline. She's going to introduce Dr. Sachs, ask a couple of questions, and then we'll have time for your questions. Many of you, but not all of you, have a couple of items on the chairs. Not all of you, because we didn't bring as many flyers as we should have. These are both about the New Israel Fund. The New Israel Fund coordinator for Washington is the person who helped us find Natan for this session. New Israel Fund does a lot of things, so one of those flyers is about the New Israel Fund. The one that's in white, I scribbled on it, is about a future session here. It'll be advertised by CBI, but probably not for a few weeks. But just to give you an early heads up, this is about an organization called Standing Together, an organization of Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians, citizens, who are working together to try to bring peace and mutual understanding and mutual respect. That might seem like a dream far off right now to many of us, but in my opinion, that's even more reason why we need to hear from these folks. This will be not live, but on Zoom. They're in Israel. This will be February 11th, and if you know how to handle a QR code, this will give you information. If you don't know how to handle a QR code, just ask a teenager near you, because you can finish that sentence. Let me see if there's anything else. So I want to just say a little bit about our moderator, Caroline Collenberg. Thank you, Caroline. She's a scholar of Jewish and Middle Eastern history at UVA. Her teaching and research interests are on the history of Israel and Palestine, relationships between history and memory, something that those of us who get older think about, Mizrahi Jewish history and the history of minorities in the Eastern Mediterranean. A terrific background for today's program, Caroline, and thank you so much, Natan, for being here.
All right, well, thank you so much, Russ, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. Can you all hear me? All right, I will be very brief in the introduction. As Russ mentioned, I'm Caroline Collenberg. I teach at UVA in Jewish history and Middle Eastern history, and I've taught several variations of courses on Israel and Palestine. So I'm very excited to learn today from Dr. Natan Sachs in our conversation with him. I was told that initially Dr. Sachs was actually invited to speak here prior to the horrific attacks on Israel on October 7th, and he was scheduled to speak on the massive protest movements and political aspects of internal Israeli politics that we all probably remember. That certainly was the headline news before October in 2023. Since then, of course, since October 7th and the Hamas attacks on Israel, followed by the onset of war in Gaza, which, as we all know, is ongoing and has led to extremely high numbers of Palestinian civilian casualties, we have changed the topic, and Dr. Sachs will be speaking to those events. These events, we know, have sparked very different opinions globally and politics globally, and I suspect in this room as well. All of this makes today's session with Dr. Sachs even more timely and even more important. Since October 7th, Dr. Sachs's voice has continued to be very important. I've seen his writing and listened to him speak. It's appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, NPR, The Forward, and various podcasts. Today, Dr. Sachs's lecture will be titled October 7th, the Gaza War, U.S.-Israel Relations, and the Future of Israeli Politics. Dr. Sachs is the director of the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and he is an expert on Israeli foreign policy and politics, as well as U.S. policy towards the Middle East. Dr. Sachs will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll follow this. I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll have a decent amount of time for all of y'all's questions. The way that this is going to work, very briefly, is that if you have a question, you can raise your hand. We'll have ushers come and give you an index card, and then we'll collect them and ask. And that way we can get to as many questions and hear as much from Dr. Sachs as possible. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Natan Sachs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Please do call me Natan. Dr. Sachs is my sister, and I thank you very much, Russ, for the invitation, Anita, Rabbi, the whole congregation. I started sort of thinking what I would say, and I thought I'd say it's a pleasure to be with you. I'll be perfectly frank, it's not. Nothing has been much of a pleasure on this topic, and it's not a special pleasure to speak about this. We've seen truly horrific events on October 7th. I'm sure many of you know many people in Israel and probably been there. Every Israeli either knows someone directly or someone who knows someone who was affected in a major way, sometimes still affected in a major way on October 7th. And since then, we've seen an ongoing war, which has had enormous suffering. As Caroline said, in the Gaza Strip, huge numbers of civilians dead and enormous physical destruction. And in Israel, still hundreds of thousands of people internally displaced from their homes, living across Israel, displaced either from the border with the Gaza Strip or with the northern border with Lebanon. Rockets still ongoing, and of course the news of dead soldiers every day from the Gaza Strip, and civilians and sometimes soldiers also in the northern border waiting to hear more. So I want to start with that. This is a terrible moment in many sense. We're still mourning, and the mourning is only being multiplied day by day. And it is grim, to be perfectly frank. I will try to end with optimism is much too strong a word, but perhaps some kind of sense of positivity at the very end, but don't get your hopes too high about what that will be. But nonetheless, I wanted to start with that. But I do think that, I come from the policy world. I probably know much less than Caroline, who comes from pure academia. In the policy world, our job is not only to analyze and try to understand what is happening, but to try to think, what is the path forward? To try to do work for those in government in Washington or anywhere else who are too busy to think slightly longer term. And therefore, I think it's my job, but I would suggest it's a good idea for anyone to try to not only lament and not only think about how terrible things are, they are, but also about what we might do. And if what we might do would lead to less awful rather than wonderful, dayenu, right? That's worth a lot. That's worth life's work. I'll just end by one little caveat. I come from the Brookings Institution, of course, but Brookings takes no position on anything, so I don't speak for either Brookings or any of my colleagues, and certainly not for the New Israel Fund, who I certainly know and like the Washington director, but I'm not part of them, nor are they responsible for anything I say. I'll describe a little bit October 7th, but especially from the Israeli perspective, what that meant, and what's the backdrop, the strategic backdrop for October 7th, and therefore what it changes in Israeli minds. I think many of you probably know, and I think a lot of people have discussed this in the United States, but I think it is still underappreciated just how much has transformed in the Israeli outlook of their very condition and what they are willing to suffer and to incur on others since October 7th. And without understanding that, one simply cannot understand what is happening even today in Gaza, but certainly in the north or anywhere else. I'll then talk a little bit about the war right now, where it stands and where I think it might be going, but also what I think it might mean. And I'll touch on 2 points, which is the war is not only in Gaza. There is already an active war in the northern border between Hezbollah and Israel. There might be much more of a war there, and if there was, it could dwarf even what's happening in Gaza. And I'll touch on the Houthis, which is not something I've discussed much until recently, but we have an attempt to blockade the Red Sea to a certain degree, and so I'll touch upon that. I'll talk a bit about U.S.-Israel relations, the bear hug, as it's known, Biden hugging Netanyahu, trying to steer him where he wants, but also reactions in the United States. I'm sure many of you follow that just as much as I do, so I won't be too lengthy on that, but maybe a thought or two on that. And I'll touch on the future of Israeli politics, relating also to the original reason I was invited. So all that will be easy, 5-10 minutes and we'll be done. So October 7th was an enormous, shocking, terrible tactical surprise. I happened to be awake. I have a very little baby. So I was awake at 1 a.m. DC time, which is about 8 a.m. Israel time. It was about an hour and 31 minutes into the attack. And so I was following live on Twitter mostly, and WhatsApp with friends, including right there at the border, in increasing incredulity. I could not believe what I'm seeing. It seemed unreal. The first image that really seemed just perplexing was of a pickup truck of Hamas fighters in Ofakim, which is a town in southern Israel, not even right on the border. It's a bit removed. And they were wandering around looking for people to kill. And there was no military stopping them. They kept driving around. So much so that I didn't think it was real. I didn't retweet it or anything like that. I thought this is probably some other pickup truck, and everyone is now jumping on fake news. It was real. And everything else was far worse than we even thought in the beginning. It was the nightmare of the pogroms and the nightmare of everything else. But I'll also say, and this is, I think, very important to understanding the Israeli mindset, it's not just European nightmares that we share here in the United States. It is also the nightmares of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the Jewish perspective. It was the reconfirmation in the worst possible way of the deepest fears that Jewish Israelis have of what would happen if they were overpowered. In other words, that they have no chance but to win every fight, because if not, the absolutely unthinkable would happen. Massacre, burning, rape, mass rape, things that they simply will not suffer. And this was an enormous tactical surprise, one that is still shocking from the intelligence perspective, but also from the military preparedness perspective. I don't want to get too deep into it, but there are a lot of very important questions. From the very first moments, this was reminiscent for Israelis. From that day, even, people were talking about 50 years and 1 day prior, October 6, 1973, the surprise attack of the Syrians, but especially the Egyptians, crossing the Suez Canal and overwhelming the initial force of the Israeli military, entering the Sinai, and in the Golan coming very close to sweeping into the Galilee, into Israel proper, and potentially conquering Israeli towns and villages. That too was an enormous tactical surprise. It's attributed in the Israeli mindset, the collective memory, to what's known in Hebrew as the conceptia, which is sort of the paradigm, the conceptual framework that, as people describe it, overwhelmed it created confirmation bias and made people reinterpret new data, intelligence data in particular, to reconfirm what they already believed. At the time, that Egypt would not enter another fight with Israel so shortly after the Six-Day War, when it was defeated, unless it gained air superiority, and that Syria would not enter without Egypt, which is probably true. That was disconfirmed, of course, in a terrible way. And here, this year, it was a different kind of conceptia. It was many conceptions, and people are still discussing exactly which it was. But certainly there was a very strong sense in Israeli intelligence. I had heard it just the prior December in Israel from intelligence analysts. Israel was extremely concerned with Hezbollah, extremely concerned with the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It was very concerned also with the destabilization in Israeli society and what that meant for the appetite and the sense of weakness that others were perceiving in Israel. But they thought that the Gaza Strip was the least of the concerns for two main reasons. One is that they thought Hamas was focused on trying to govern the Gaza Strip, get as much as it can, tax as much as it can, and better its position in Palestinian politics. But second, that the Israeli strategy or operational strategy towards Hamas, had been successful in recent years, a mix of sticks, especially in the last round, and carrots, a significant easing of the blockade in recent years that would offer Hamas incentive to continue along that path rather than to lessen it. That, of course, was simply untrue, and we saw Hamas enter with thousands of troops and do what they did. But the important point here is that it's not, to my mind, only a tactical failure, it was a strategic failure as well. The strategic failure was a long-standing approach by Israel to the Gaza Strip. It's not only by Benjamin Netanyahu, although certainly he was prime minister for most of it, but it started even before that. And it stemmed from a broader Israeli strategy or approach that elsewhere I've called anti-solutionism. And that emerged after the second Intifada of the early 2000s. The Intifada starts in the late summer of 2000 and lasts for about 4 or 5 years, and the disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And this was the perception in Israel that there is no readily available solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that therefore, all those Americans, the John Kerrys and everyone else who comes to Israel and says, how are you going to solve this? The center-right Israeli response, which was and is the dominant Israeli political sort of pole, I'm trying to reflect their opinion, not necessarily my own, not my own, was that, no, you fools, you think everything has a solution, that with enough enterprise and energy and effort and finding this angle or this leader or that leader, we can solve every problem. Where do you live? What are you talking about? Maybe in the Midwest, but not in the Middle East. And by the way, not in the Midwest either. Because most problems in the world do not have solutions. Death, for example, does not have a solution. And what we do with it is we manage it. We postpone it. We kick the can down the road. We try to, in the meantime, do as much of whatever we want as possible. But it catches up in the end. And most medical problems do not have solutions. But nonetheless, we deal with them. Naftali Bennett comes from the right wing to the right of Netanyahu, but became then prime minister for a year after Netanyahu, in between Netanyahu. He described it as, I happened to go to a conference of the settler movement as a quasi-reporter, not as a member, and he was talking there. He said a friend of his from military service had shrapnel stuck in his back, near his backside, he said, which, yeah, I can try. And I also need to speak slowly, my wife always tells me. Sorry. So Naftali Bennett said a friend from the military had shrapnel stuck near his backside, which got a lot of news, but that wasn't the point really. It was close to his spine. And he said the doctors told him, I can operate and we may save you all the pain, but you may lose your ability to walk. Or we could leave it as is and it will be painful, but you will continue to walk. And he said the answer is simple. It's painful. It's not ideal, as is, in his mind, the conflict, but it's fundamentally insoluble. And many Israelis believe this, especially after the failure of Camp David, even more so the Second Intifada. And therefore, what they need to do in their mind is to kick the can down the road from a conservative point of view, not rock the boat, not have any grand designs to reorder the world, but rather to try and manage things in a cautious, conservative way. Now, I hasten to say they were not actually doing conservatism. Okay? It was faux conservatism. Because what Netanyahu was actually, especially Netanyahu, but not only him, what Netanyahu especially was leading was a wait-and-see approach on anything to do with the diplomatic scene, but in the meantime, allow settlement construction to continue, allow the Palestinian Authority to weaken, and I'm coming back to our topic, allow Hamas, who was no partner ever to any kind of peace, to not thrive, certainly, it was under Israeli blockade, but Israeli-Egyptian blockade, but to find a modus vivendi with Hamas. And Netanyahu even described this as, and let me preface by saying, if Netanyahu could have made Hamas disappear with a snap of a finger, of course he would. Every Israeli would. They've been murdering Israelis since they were created in the 80s. But given the cost of bringing them down, he thought better to find a way to live with them. And he said to his supporters, in the meantime, that weakens the Palestinian Authority, with whom there might be a diplomatic process that the Americans would be pushing, and therefore that even furthers our goal of stopping that kind of American pressure. That kind of conceptia of finding a modus vivendi with Hamas, I would add weakening the Palestinian Authority, that is part of what crumbled on October 7th. And for Israelis, this idea that they would live with Hamas, that is the fundamental thing that they would not agree to anymore. The weakening of the PA side, I added. Most Israelis don't necessarily add that part. So the fundamental lesson that was learned, and this was learned in the most base, fundamental way, is that Israel may not ever allow that to happen again. Ever, under any circumstances, no matter how much it's hated on any campus anywhere, UVA not included, it will not allow that to happen. And that doesn't mean simply better intelligence. It means if there is a terrorist group with a statelet, sovereign in a statelet adjoining Israel or abutting Israel, they will not allow that terrorist group anymore to rule, govern, and build up its forces, waiting for a moment when Israel's guard might be down. And therefore, if for 16 years Israel has lived with Hamas on the calculation governing Gaza, under the calculation that entering to bring down Hamas would be extremely costly for Israeli forces, and of course also for the Gaza Strip, with all that entails worldwide, as we're seeing just now. If that was the calculation until October 6th, by October 7th, those prices were worth it. Israel would pay an enormous price, and it would incur an enormous price, because October 7th became immediately at the level of never again. That is not allowed. Yihareg uval yavor. That cannot happen, whatever price it is. And in some ways, it's the reason of being of Israel. Not for everyone. There are many different reasons of being for Israel, but part of it certainly is that Jews would be able to defend themselves against pogroms of that kind without begging favor from anyone, without hoping that those who would occupy them or attack them would spare their lives. That's a big part of the point. And therefore, this cannot be allowed. It also means that there are other regions where that could be the case. It also means that Hezbollah, which governs in Lebanon, or doesn't govern Lebanon, but is the strongest force in Lebanon by far, and is also the heavyweight of Lebanese politics, is deployed right on the Israeli border, and has for many years said that the next war will be conducted in the Galilee, in Israel, or in Palestine as they would call it, and that they will occupy towns and villages in the Galilee. And therefore Israel has evacuated the civilians from the northern part of Israel, the very strip alongside the border, and has declared very clearly that they will not allow Hezbollah to continue to be deployed along the border, which incidentally is counter to UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that ended the 2006 war. So Hezbollah, by international law, is not allowed to deploy along the southern border. Only the official Lebanese military, the Lebanese armed forces, are allowed to be there. And it is Israel's demand that Hezbollah, the fighters, be pushed back north of the Litani River in accordance with that resolution. And if that was not the case, Israel would act militarily to do so. So the Gaza war itself then emerges from this. It emerges from this truly generational trauma in Israel, and even more than generational trauma. This is a day that is going to be remembered in synagogues long past my lifetime. It's more than generational. This is going to be one of the terrible tragedies that we will mark. In Simchat Torah, right, the holiday on which it happened, that will be remembered just like Yom Kippur. For any Israeli, Yom Kippur has two very different meanings. So we'll Simchat Torah, or October 7th, we'll see what emerges in memory. And in that sense, this war, as absolutely horrific as it is, I want to be clear, is in the Israeli mindset subsumed by this generational trauma. And so when Israelis look at what has happened, some of them have hardened their hearts because of reliving and still living what happened on October 7th, but many of them have not necessarily, but reason, at least many of them, that this is a price to be paid to fundamentally solve that problem of this enemy statelet, which means removing Hamas, and that all this could end in a day, very easily, if Hamas simply handed over its weapons, not to Israel necessarily, even to the Palestinian Authority, released the hostages, and left. It would all be over. Hamas is not going to do that, of course, it doesn't care much, but therein lies, that's sort of the rub from the Israeli perspective. The outcome is exactly what Israel feared all those 16 years. When Israel did not enter the Gaza Strip all those years to bring down Hamas, despite all the many dozens of thousands of rockets and all the attempts to infiltrate prior, it was precisely for fear of what would happen in the day after, or the day after invading. It would be international opprobrium, it would be absolutely horrific situation in Gaza Strip, humanitarian crisis that is only just beginning, that is already terrible. And that is exactly what is happening. We see the PR catastrophe abroad. We see the human catastrophe in the Gaza Strip, the humanitarian one alongside the deaths already. All this is very true, and it is part exactly of that dilemma. And it creates among Palestinians, let's not mince words, a generational trauma that will be remembered long past my lifetime. This is a huge number of people killed in a small place, and this will be remembered, and it will not be forgiven from the Palestinian perspective. Many of them, some of them deny what happened on October 7th or think it's all exaggerated, it wasn't like that. And even those who know it happened think that is the detail, this is the real story, just as Israelis think the reverse. Now, I want to pause for a moment and go back. If you think of Gaza, I think this exemplifies Gaza as a one-word argument. If you say Gaza in English, even before this war, even on October 6th, if you said Gaza in English, in many circles that would have been a one-word argument for the cruelty of Israel and Israel's willingness to make Palestinians suffer sort of with indifference or maybe malice, more than indifference, because of a 16-year Israeli-Egyptian blockade of the Gaza Strip, and because of the recurring rounds, which, as you would always see on the New York Times, that would count the dead, that would sort of imply that's proportionality. I'll just hasten to say that is not proportionality in international law at all, but they would count the dead, and they would show that Palestinians suffer many, many more dead. Israel is much stronger. And in other words, in English, that became a one-word thing. But the irony here is that if you say Gaza or Aza in Hebrew, it was before October 7th a one-word argument for the absolute danger of what happens if Israel cedes territory to Palestinians, period, or to an enemy, and of the hypocrisy of the world. Because for Israelis, the fundamental context for them is the disengagement, the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. In the Israeli understanding, Israel withdrew, and this is actually fact, but Israel withdrew all its troops and every last settler, kindergarten, graveyard, synagogue, everything from the Gaza Strip and from the Gaza border with Egypt, which was controversial in the Israeli decision-making because that allowed the arming and everything else of any group in the Gaza Strip via Egypt without Israeli control, and withdrew everything in 2005, and I'll also say, from the northern West Bank. They also withdrew some settlements, but not the military, from the northern West Bank. And this was part of the understandings between the Israeli government of Ariel Sharon at the time, Olmert succeeding him, and the Bush administration, with very close relations between the administrations, and with the understanding from the Israeli perspective, or the belief and statements, you can easily see the statements in retrospect, that Israel will now be fulfilling what the world has always asked it. It will withdraw completely from the occupied territories. The Palestinians will have every opportunity to do whatever they want to do. Build Singapore was sort of the tagline. Build a wonderful, successful Singapore on the Mediterranean. And if they don't, if they use this opportunity to build a fortress from which to attack Israel with better position, Israel will have every international legitimacy to fight back. And so for Israelis, years before October 7th, that proved first, they did not choose Singapore. Within 2 years, they elected Hamas, and then Hamas takes over with force in the Gaza Strip, throwing sometimes off the roof Fatah operatives of the secular movement that now governs Ramallah. And the international community, far from seeing Israel as legitimately defending itself after the withdrawal, now understands Israel to be the cruel oppressor again. Even more so, according to many international organizations, Israel continued to occupy the Gaza Strip, even without a single Israeli inside the Gaza Strip. You hear people talk about a one-state reality, which I think, and write about it, which I think has some merit when you talk about Israel and the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, they would also say there it's different, but it is still occupied, it's still part of one state. How? Because Israel controls every single aspect of life in the Gaza Strip. This is prior to October 7th. I'll note that shortly after October 7th, I got a question in one talk. Since Israel controlled every single aspect of the Gaza Strip daily life, how can Hamas have organized this? Which I thought was an excellent question. And the answer, of course, was that Israel did not control every single aspect of life. In fact, there was a whole army, a whole military organized in the Gaza Strip without Israel's control. So for the Israeli mindset, to some, is exactly the reverse. Gaza was a one-word argument, and that is part of, when you look now at what is happening, people say there is a context. Israelis think, yes, exactly, there is a context. Don't you understand? This is an enemy territory that should have been a flourishing deoccupied, free beginning of Palestine, or part of Palestine. That brings us to where we are today. And again, I don't want to mince words. The Israeli response has been extremely wounded. If you look at Israeli media in English, but especially in Hebrew, or I was there very recently, Israelis are living October 7th. They are still uncovering the stories. They are still finding out about friends and relatives. And they are especially still preoccupied with the fate of still over 130 hostages. They know the names, right? I can name many of the hostages. And this is what Israelis are dealing with. And that is part of why they see something so very different from what so many people abroad see, which is mostly the images from the Gaza Strip, but it has this background that I'm describing. Now, this war has other arenas, and so let me shift gear. The first is Lebanon, that I already mentioned. The lesson that Israelis learned about the Gaza Strip applies to Lebanon as well. Or really about Hamas applies to Hezbollah. Except that Hezbollah is much stronger than Hamas, much stronger. Hamas is one of two Palestinian factions, the Islamist faction, a Muslim Brotherhood kind of organization, that was under extreme duress because of the Israeli-Egyptian blockade. Israel was blockading the sea and the air. Egypt was, at most times, blockading the border between the Gaza Strip and the Sinai, not always. And therefore, their ability to arm themselves was limited. Nonetheless, they were able to do this. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is not blockaded in any way. It is able to arm itself. It has enormous support from Iran. Hamas has some support from Iran. You'll hear that a lot in the news, especially from Israelis. But we should caveat, and that is true, but we should caveat it. They are very different. Hamas is a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood organization. Iran is a Shia power. They absolutely cooperate. They openly say so. But it's a marriage of convenience. It's an expediency. Hezbollah started as an arm of Iran. It is now not only a proxy of Iran, it is also a Lebanese party, an organic one with massive support among the Shia in Lebanon, but it is closely tied to Iran. It is Shia, it is organizationally tied in a very intimate way. And it is armed in ways that Hamas never was, and with impunity that Hamas never had because of its ability to essentially govern Lebanon or half govern Lebanon. And I'll just note, this is an anomaly. You are in theory not supposed to have a giant militia within a sovereign country with its separate military, right? There's supposed to be one gun in each country. That's that is the definition of a state in at least sociology. Moreover, Hezbollah in recent years, Iran and Hezbollah in recent years have been very hard at work on a project of making many thousands of rockets that Hezbollah has into precise missiles. What that means is that right now it has dozens of thousands, many dozens of thousands of rockets that it can lob onto most of Israel. Certainly almost all the population of Israel is under fire. But these would be statistical rockets that are fired in enormous amounts. They will be fired. You can't decide exactly where it will hit, but you can say target Haifa, and now you can target Tel Aviv, even south of that, as Nasrallah boasted. However, what they've been trying to do, and have probably succeeded to a limited degree, but succeeded, is to make some of these precise missiles, which means that you can hit, say, a radius of 10 meters or so. And now you can decide, instead of hitting Haifa, you can hit the port of Haifa in a specific place in the port of Haifa, or the airport near Tel Aviv, or the purported nuclear reactor in southern Israel, or any other site. Israel's about the size of New Jersey, so if you imagine trying to shut down New Jersey, which I would never do, but if you had precise munitions, you wanted to shut down New Jersey, imagine how incredibly easy that would be. You hit the turnpike, the power stations, the bridges to Philadelphia, New York, you're done. It's over. That's kind of the story. And so Israel, for years, has had what it calls the campaign between the campaigns. So not a war with Hezbollah, but a campaign between the wars, where it was targeted shipments of munitions and technology from Iran via Syria to Lebanon, and to a certain degree in Lebanon and in Syria, attempts to build up this technology by Hezbollah itself. But all this to say that Israel's fear of Hezbollah is far greater than its fear even of Hamas, at least before October 7th. And if Hamas was able to do this, well, then Hezbollah with far more and better trained forces would be able to do far more if the Israeli civilians were right on the border. As I said, the Israeli demand is quite clear. There is a diplomatic precedent, UN Security Council 1701, and in theory that could be achieved. So I'll preface this as one point of not optimism, but at least I can see a diplomatic path forward, and there are senior American officials working at it at the moment to try to broker a deal by which Hezbollah would respect that UN Security Council resolution, and Israel would refrain from fighting. I'll get to back to that in a moment, but I'll say there's also another front, of course, and that's the Houthis. The Houthi are a Yemeni group that now controls much of Yemen. It's a Shia group, but it is not the same Shiism exactly as Iran or Hezbollah. It's not 12 or Shiism, and in that sense, it's a bit different. It's again a bit of a marriage of kind of expediency. And they have been the partisan with the war, especially with the Saudis and Saudi-backed Yemenis, but also the Emiratis and others, on behalf of Iran to a large degree. And now they have entered this war on behest of Iran and Hezbollah, with whom they have a lot of relations as well, and with very simple means have managed to target ships that they can sort of deem are Israeli in some way. Now, ships are usually not really one nationality or another. They carry one flag, they're owned by another, they have other shadow owners behind, and the cargo is someone completely different or anyone. So it's really been lots of different ships. And the point is that in shipping, someone here probably knows much more about this than I, but in the shipping, if interest rates, or insurance rates, I should say, go up, the route dies down, right? So if you target a few ships, Maersk or Costco, any of the giants of shipping, will simply not go through there. The Red Sea leads to the Suez Canal, which is the second busiest channel of maritime trade in the world, and maritime trade is the bulk of trade in the world. So this is enormously important. It's enormously important not only in this context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but in general. If this is shut down, then the Straits of Malacca or of Singapore, the busiest straits, and many others could be shut down with simple unmanned aerial vehicles or other weapons that the Houthis now have from Iran. Which brings me to the United States. You've probably seen that just this week, the United States and Britain and others have struck in Yemen. Their calculation is that this issue is far bigger than this fight, and that this is one of securing international trade, and therefore an issue that the United States is keenly interested in, not only in the Middle East. But it is also part and parcel of a broader American approach. From the very beginning, from October 7th itself, President Biden came out with very strong solidarity for Israel, truly remarkably so, putting him, I think, in Israeli minds in line with Truman and Kissinger and now Biden, and of course, incurring enormous wrath for it from those who are critical of just that. The logic, and I don't want to get into much of the calculation, but the logic for the Biden administration was not only Biden's own conviction that he has to stand for this, and the same logic of the Israelis that Hamas, after that, may not be allowed to govern a statelet anywhere, but also that one of the prime policy objectives for the Biden administration must be to contain this war. Because if this war grew beyond Israel-Gaza in a bigger way than it already has, this could be absolutely horrific. I described the strength of Hezbollah, but of course, if Hezbollah is that strong, you can imagine what the Israeli response would be. This would be absolutely devastating for Lebanon, a country already under economic and political crisis. And therefore, from the very beginning, the Biden administration did both project to others, especially Hezbollah and Iran, what the consequences might be. 2 aircraft carrier groups sent to the region, to different areas, and explicit words from Biden. Don't, he said to anyone who's considered joining this, organization or country considering joining this, don't, right? It's from the United States. And I don't know the full calculation of Hezbollah and Iran, but so far, that has been remarkably successful. We have seen this Hezbollah-Israel war, but it's far lower than it might have been so far, right? It's early in the day. And that is to their great credit. It also meant convincing the Israelis not to preempt in Lebanon. Reportedly, on October 11th, reportedly quite well reported, on October 11th, Israel was considering a major preemptive strike in Lebanon, with the argument in the Israeli establishment that if they are fighting a two-front war, they need to start with a stronger front, not the weaker one. They will find themselves bogged down for months in the Gaza question, while Hezbollah will come out unscathed, and then they will have to face Hezbollah. And so there were those in the Israeli establishment that thought, take the fight to the core, and the core really would be Tehran, but at the very least, start with Hezbollah. And the Americans stayed their hand. Not only the Americans, but especially Biden, not just any American. Biden personally stayed their hand. And that was a big part of what's happening, the war that we have not seen so far. Secondly, of course, is the issue of the Houthis, which the Israelis have not responded to yet. It's left to the international group. We'll see if Israel ever gets into that. It's quite far from Israel, but it's an issue that the Americans have taken up. But of course, this has created things that I do not need to tell you much about, which is this enormous rift in the American society, on campuses, a huge generational divide, chasm, really, in the view of this whole issue. There are many people for whom describing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as I did, is itself anathema. There is no conflict. There is an occupation, or there's one oppressor and there's a story of settler colonialism and 100 years of resistance, which is the subtitle of one of the most popular books on this. I disagree vehemently. I think, by the way, even in those conditions or any conditions, there can be a conflict. But it's important to recognize this. This is a very different way of looking at the whole issue. There is no issue of what they did on October 7th or not. This is an oppression by one side and resistance by another. Perhaps ugly, perhaps illegitimate, but nonetheless resistance. And it's created for Biden a political nightmare, a real political nightmare, within his own party. I live in Washington, Congress people and their staff do not necessarily see things eye to eye. It's a major issue in the Democratic Party, and not only on the progressive side of the Democratic Party, and that's a very important issue, I think. I'll hasten to say also, if Biden loses in November, which he may, I don't know, it will be easily, I have feelings about that too, but it would easily be attributed to this. It may or may not be about it, but certainly if he loses Michigan, where there's a very large Muslim American population, I'm sure people will say it's because of this, and that will be a lesson that many Democrats learn. And we may see a dramatic acceleration of the splitting of the Israel issue into Republican versus Democrat. And this, of course, is tied also, I'll end in a minute so we can get, I think I'll be on time even. This is tied also, of course, to the background, to the original reason that I was actually delighted to then accept the invitation to come, which is the turmoil in Israel and the coalition that now governs in Israel, which is extremely unpopular, certainly among Democrats, and I would say rightly so. This is the most extreme right-wing government Israel's ever had, not maybe the most extreme, not sort of, absolutely the most extreme, including members that used to be shunned by the right, the center-right, Netanyahu's own Likud party. In the 1980s, which I do remember, 1980s, the Likud would usually, en masse, leave the plenary of the Israeli Knesset when Meir Kahane, who called himself a rabbi, would speak and spew his vile racism against Arabs. The Likud party would leave, the center-right Likud party that now Netanyahu leads. Now, Ben Gvir is not Kahane, but he does see himself as a disciple of Kahane. That's how he describes himself. He had for years a picture of a mass terrorist, Baruch Goldstein, in his home. And he was brought in not only to the Knesset, but to the coalition by Netanyahu. Netanyahu was heavily involved in orchestrating the political dynamic that would allow them to be elected, and then made him a senior minister. It's morally repugnant. It is also dangerous, because the portfolio he got has real sway not on this war. He has no say on this war, by the way, but on internal affairs and especially security in Jerusalem, which is under police jurisdiction, not military jurisdiction. He has real sway. And of course, on January 4th last year, this coalition, this government embarked on what they call the judicial reform, which I and many others would describe as at least a judicial overhaul, an attempt to politicize and gut all checks on activity by the Israeli government and the Knesset. I can get to that more in depth if anyone wants in the Q&A, but to summarize it, if you think of, say, the American House of Representatives, not this one, truly not this one. If a small majority in one House of Representatives in the United States wanted to pass a bill that was clearly abusing minority rights, okay, or stripping me of my citizenship because I'm so annoying and critical. Well, they would have to get a majority in the Senate. They would probably need to get over a filibuster even. Then they would go through all sorts of courts in the federal system, and then finally they would come to the Supreme Court, and all that would be counter to a clearly articulated Bill of Rights as part of a clearly articulated Constitution that makes it clear that you cannot do that. I could be as annoying as I want, you still may not strip me of my citizenship or worse. If the Israeli Knesset today were to pass by a small majority, were to pass the same law saying I'm saying these things now abroad, defaming the coalition, they're going to strip me of my Israeli citizenship, which I have. The checks on them would not be a Senate, there is none. It would not be federal courts, they have no jurisdiction. It would not be any Bill of Rights, there is none. In any clearly written constitution, there is none. It would be one thing. The Supreme Court with a special hat called the High Court of Justice. That's it. If you take away the Supreme Court, then in theory, any majority of the Knesset could do it in a second. And by the way, to change the Constitution in the United States would be almost impossible. You would need a lengthy process and confirmation by the states and the Senate, 2/3 of the state, I believe. It could not happen, right? In the United States, it would take 2 days, maybe a week, with a simple majority of the Knesset. And that was what they were trying to gut, with the excuses that, look, in the United States, you also appoint judges politically, which we do, but we also have a general system within that, within which that works or doesn't work, we can debate. So on that backdrop, we saw these enormous demonstrations in Israel, which are not the cause of what happened on October 7th, but certainly were taken into mind by Hezbollah and others, and probably Hamas, which identified a weakness, a moment of weakness in what they think anyway is a weak Israel that's about to crumble under the weight of its own iniquity. And we saw an Israeli population that on the one hand is extremely united after October 7th, with real enormous solidarity among itself, but is dramatically polarized over its leadership, with a prime minister who is currently extremely unpopular, but whose devotees disagree with his opponents in sort of fundamental ways reminiscent of maybe the United States. I'll say, will Netanyahu survive, which is usually the question, who's going to be the next prime minister, right? Look, on October 7th and after, I said any logic and any reading of the polls, by the way, would suggest that Netanyahu is an ex-prime minister walking. He is deep underwater in the polls. But I'll just caution that in 2019, I, and many others, but I also wrote a piece that got the title, "The End of Netanyahu is Nigh." That was 2019, which is now 5 years ago. He's very, very good at politics. He's very, very smart, and he is shameless. 2019, I wrote that in the context of his indictments. I thought an Israeli prime minister is not going to survive that. His allies will betray him. They did not, and he had no intention of resigning. He has no intention now. Absolutely none. He's been conducting politics during the war. The leader in the polls is Benny Gantz, who has joined the emergency coalition as a member of the mini war cabinet, but without a portfolio. But when and where we get to elections, we don't know. The bets in Israel are that in 2024, we will probably see elections, and probably Benny Gantz would win them in some form or another. But again, I would take all of this with a grain of salt. Would that be different? In some senses, no. A lot of what Israel is doing is not about Bibi right now. It's about a very strong Israeli consensus of the things I described before. But in other ways, yes. Benny Gantz is very, very different from Netanyahu. He's much more trustworthy. He's less brilliant and less charismatic in many ways, much less so. But he's sort of trustworthy in kind of almost a boring kind of way, and which would be great. And he would be a much easier interlocutor for the United States. And on one key crucial issue, there would be an enormous divide on what is the answer on the day after, in particular, what it would be the role of the Palestinian Authority. I mentioned before that when Netanyahu was sort of finding modus vivendi with Hamas and weakening the PA, Well, he now too still is warning of the PA, saying the PA is not, the Palestinian Authority is not the answer. That cannot be the one that governs the Gaza Strip. Gantz is not saying too much about it publicly right now because he knows where the public mood is, but I would venture a very strong guess that he has a very different view. He knows, he understands, by the way, so does Bibi, that eventually the only reasonable path forward would be secular Palestinian forces, parties, taking at least civilian control of the Gaza Strip, and that would mean more or less the PA. I promised mini optimism. So first I'd say on Lebanon there is some hope. And I'd say another thing. Before October 7th, Washington was abuzz, Washington Middle East issues were abuzz with the possibility of Israeli-Saudi normalization and what the United States might do about that. That is much harder in many ways today, but is fundamentally still in the cards. The interests of the parties have not changed, and this is the working assumption of the American administration, the Israeli administration, and I believe the Saudi as well. And now, the Palestinian content of that normalization might be much clearer than it was before. If Saudi Arabia could play a constructive role in the Gaza Strip, and if Israel were willing to do what would be necessary in terms of a political horizon that would allow the Saudis to do so, that would allow at least the ingredients of some path forward, of a serious Arab actor allowing secular Palestinian forces to play a major role, and I would also say with the funds to foot an enormous bill of reconstruction. And I'll end just with a sort of more philosophical point. It's not technically darkest before the dawn, but when it's very, very dark, it's worth to remember that at some point there will be a dawn of kind. And as I said before, I think if we lower our standards of what good would be, there's a lot that we can do. I think part of the problem, even of anti-solutionism that I described before, it was this belief that there is no perfect solution at hand to the conflict, and therefore all we can do is kick the can down the road. And for many actually pushing on the solutionist side, it was always, if we just do X, Y, or Z, then the conflict will be declared over. And I am not a prophet. I don't know if the conflict can be solved or not, but perhaps that's not the only metric. Grand, capital P, peace is not the only thing we can strive for. We can strive for earthly peace as well, small p peace. Maybe the conflict won't be over, but if it allows a modicum of dignity and independence for Palestinians, for Israelis, for everyone involved, a chance to build a better life, not just with jobs and money, also that, but with political dignity and political opportunity, maybe the conflict won't be over. Certainly these generational traumas won't disappear. Maybe we'll only reach something like Cyprus, where the conflict is not over. In fact, half of the island is occupied by Turkey. But how many people have died in the Cypriot conflict this year? 0. And last year, 0. I'll take Cyprus any day. And I think in striving for that rather limited goal, there's a lot that can be done. But for that, we have to be vigorous about it. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Natan, for that really helpful and quite comprehensive understanding of the past, present, and future. I feel like we sort of went around the map of the Middle East, so thank you so much. We will now begin to start taking questions. I'll ask a few as we hand out index cards. So I guess if you have a question, just raise your hand and our ushers will allow you to write it down, and then we'll try to get to as many as possible. Really, thank you so much. I wish that, I taught 2 classes on Israel and Palestine this past semester, and I wish my students could hear you answer the questions that they asked me as a historian. One thing that I actually do at the beginning of class and at the end of class is have a knowledge quiz just to, get a sense of what they know at the very beginning and what they hopefully learn at the end. And one of the questions that I have on the knowledge quiz is what countries have a peace treaty with Israel? And the knowledge quizzes from the beginning, almost, I would say most of the students say none. You know, I have on there Egypt and Jordan, or, you know, Iraq or whatever, and most of them, or none, and most of them say none. Of course, this is not true, and they learn this, I hope, that Israel has peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, and has various types of normalization agreements with other countries, as you mentioned, perhaps one day Saudi Arabia. So what do you make of the role of those countries, I guess specifically Egypt and Jordan, but countries that the US government at least would consider more moderate in terms of their relations with Israel? What's been their role? Have they changed? Have they not?
I think it's an excellent question, and a major lacuna of what I was discussing, especially on the Egyptian side. So when Israel captured the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it captured them from Jordan and Egypt respectively. The Gaza Strip was ruled by Egypt through military occupation for 19 years, between 1948 and 1967. And it then, but also long after and even today, is the one actor that has real sway sometimes on the ground, even with Hamas, which it despises. The government in Egypt despises Muslim Brotherhood organizations, especially the Egyptian one. It came to power in a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood president that came before. But with Hamas, it has a lot of sway. It's almost unique in that sense. There are other parties, especially the Qataris, who are much more friendly to Muslim Brotherhood organizations, and to a limited degree the Turks, who are also very friendly to Muslim Brotherhood organizations. But the Egyptians are the ones that have sort of physical contact, and moreover, of these parties, have the best relations with the Israelis. The government in Egypt is extremely repressive, but it has with Israel had very close security cooperation, not just to the benefit of Israel, very much to the benefit of the Egyptian government in fighting extremists, Al-Qaeda groups and others in the Sinai, in part with connection to the Gaza Strip. Now, the Egyptians have been long terrified that the Israeli plan, the master plan, is to somehow nudge Gaza towards Egypt and make Gaza the problem of Egypt. And we'll note that Egypt, when it signed its peace treaty with Israel in 1979, it, as one Egyptian put it to me, took back every last grain of sand of the Sinai Egyptian territory and not one grain of sand of Palestine. In other words, we did not want Gaza. They had it before 1967 when Israel captured the Sinai and the Gaza Strip. They did not want Gaza back. And they are terrified and have been terrified from day one that the Israeli master plan here is to push the Palestinian population south, and eventually the border with Egypt would be open for the refugees to find some kind of refuge in Egypt, and that then they would never come back. So if you ask why are all these people in southern Gaza Strip stuck there, well, of course, it's evil Israel, that everything, but we'll note there is a border with Egypt. There's a border that Israel has no control over with an Arab country that they could have exited from. They will not, because Egypt will not allow it, because Israel's fundamental and almost national fear here is of an Israeli grand plan to push Gaza or the Gazans towards Egypt. And so the role for the United States to a large degree is to square not just the United States, I think Israel first, actually, and they have done a very poor job of this so far, is to find a way to alleviate these Egyptians' concerns with a serious role for Egypt in the future of the Gaza Strip that would allow it to both nudge Hamas where it needs to go, but also to allow the Palestinian Authority, or a new version of the Palestinian Authority, a reformed one, a revitalized one, something else, into secular forces into the Gaza Strip to govern it the day after, something which Egypt is uniquely positioned to do. So far, most of the hostage negotiations have been conducted in Doha via the Qataris, who have the most contact with Hamas. If a post-Hamas Gaza emerges, which we don't know, but if it did, one would hope that they could be replaced by the Egyptians, and they could be play a very important role. Jordan is a bit different. Jordan, of course, is very important in East Jerusalem, especially, where it also even has a formal position, according to the Israeli-Jordanian Treaty of 1994. They also still have a lot of sway, and their intelligence forces have some sway in the West Bank, but it is much less than it used to be. They used to have a lot. There used to be a lot of people in the West Bank who were sort of loyal Jordanians, and that partly stems from a big difference. If the Gaza Strip was militarily occupied by Egypt for 19 years, the West Bank was annexed by Jordan. Jordan considered itself to be East Bank Jordan and West Bank Jordan, hence the West Bank. That's why it's called the West Bank. The West Bank of the Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, most importantly. Those are the maps. I remember when I visited Jordan 3 days after the announced peace between Israel and Jordan, and you could see in the weather news, the map of Jordan included the West Bank. And that was a lot of the thinking. It certainly was the thinking of the late King Hussein, and certainly of his grandfather, but not so much of this king. In 1988, King Hussein relinquished the West Bank, made it the problem or the purview of the PLO, and since then Jordan has been adamant that it is not taking that problem back. But nonetheless, it's a more complex role there. Egypt is also much more powerful than Jordan in many ways. It's much bigger. So to answer your excellent question, they could have an enormous role. In Gaza, Egypt could really have an enormous role. And I think that this is one of, so far, the policy misses of the Israeli government, especially in not finding a way to bring them in more forcefully, allaying their concerns and bringing them in to the constructive side of things, especially if they could be brought in with the Saudis in some kind of amalgam. Not to be too fanciful, we don't know if all that will work, but these are the actors that might be positive, productive actors, warts and all, positive, productive actors, as opposed to others.
Thank you. I'll ask one more question, and we have some really excellent questions from the audience. One other thing that my students are always also surprised to learn is that about 20% of the Israeli citizens are Palestinian citizens of Israel, Israeli Arabs. And I read, maybe from something you had written, that Hamas as a political organization and ideology has become, since October 7th, correct me if I'm wrong, more popular in the West Bank and less in Gaza, although of course public opinion polls are very challenging to do. What about Palestinian citizens of Israel?
So that's a great question. So Hamas has long been, and even more so recently, more popular in the West Bank where it doesn't govern than in Gaza Strip where it did, and vice versa. The PA more popular in Gaza than in the West Bank. Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel, each one of them has a different preference as to how to be called, and I respect each one of them, but they tend to be very different. So they know Israeli society much better than Palestinian brethren just across the Green Line. That does not make them more moderate or less moderate. It just makes them more nuanced. They understand much better. There are among them a wide variety of opinions. There used to be an Arab Joint List. It's now splintered, but there used to be an Arab Joint List, and it was ideologically, it was the amalgam, truly, of a communist-based party, that was the core, an Islamist party, a rather radical nationalist party, and a more moderate conservative nationalist party, and they somehow lived together. Their opinions, and they had opinions, for example, on gay rights, okay, LGBTQ issues, which is an important issue for the communist-based party. You can imagine what the Islamist party believes on that. They have since splintered. So their opinions, run the gamut. They're not a huge population, but they are even more than 20% now of the Israeli population. Some of them speak excellent Hebrew. Certainly the leaders of the parties in the Knesset, there are three, sort of depending how you count, 2 or 3 parties, 2 of them are conjoined. Hebrew is excellent. They understand perfectly everything, and they speak in not just perfect Hebrew, but perfect spoken slang Hebrew. They really understand Israel very, very well. And opinion on the street runs the gamut. By and large, far less supportive of what happened on October 7th, and far more attuned to what really happened there. I think they see the Israeli response and maybe have an easier understanding of Jewish Israelis as human beings, even if hated or even if in conflict, but nonetheless human beings. And of course, the flip is sometimes true. So especially changes more recently among Israeli Arabs, especially the entrance of the Islamist party actually into the Israeli coalition, the prior Israeli coalition, and even the words of the leaders of these parties after October 7th, absolute clear condemnation of what happened there. The leader of the Islamist party saying this is fundamentally un-Islamic, has, I wouldn't say it captured the minds of Israelis. Most Israelis are not in the mood of capturing any kind of goodwill, but at the moment, But there are many who nonetheless see a much more complex view, whereas Palestinians, certainly in Gaza, which they haven't seen in a long time, it's much easier to disregard what, say, the numbers of dead mean there. Just today, I saw a report. Ahmed Tibi was one of the leaders of, he's the leader of one of the parties in the Knesset. He's a gynecologist, a long-time member of parliament, very, very smart man, excellent Hebrew, as I said. 3 family members, including a 10-year-old named Ahmed Tibi, just were killed in Gaza. And that's the kind of thing that's something you see also many Israeli journalists and members of Knesset, who even if they spar with him publicly, it's open secret that in private they're all good friends. They like him a lot. He's a very likable man. I've met him. You could see even on Twitter and elsewhere, conveying genuine condolences, something that is not something you'd hear from Israelis mostly about what's happening in Gaza, because that is, first of all, beyond the mountains somewhere, not physically, but metaphorically, and secondly, beyond the veil of October 7th.
We have a question here asking, is the goal of destroying Hamas realistic? How do you see Hamas going forward?
So the goal of destroying Hamas and eradicating it from the face of the earth is completely unrealistic. But that's not the Israeli goal. That's the way many people report about it, and then they say it cannot be done. And of course it can be done. Hamas is one of the 2 major Palestinian parties. It has wide political base. It won the last election, which was a very long time ago, but by plurality, by the way, not a majority, but it won them. And it's also an idea. It's the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine, or at least outside Israel. The Islamist party that I mentioned before is part of the Muslim Brotherhood inside Israel. So it can't be eradicated. But the Israeli goal, not in the nonsense verbiage that you hear from so many Israeli politicians, reckless and sometimes extremely dangerous verbiage that you hear, but from the actual instructions to the military, for example, and the way they define the goals, it is to dismantle Hamas completely as a governing force in the Gaza Strip and a military threat from the Gaza Strip. That can be done. The cost of that is enormous, as we've already seen. It's mostly been achieved, according to the Israelis, in the northern Gaza Strip. We saw the cost. And it could be done in the southern Gaza Strip. It's already being done, not in the same way. Fewer casualties, much less air bombardment, many more Israeli casualties, all this mostly because of American pressure, but also less success so far. And we'll see how long it lasts. We'll see how successful they are. It, in theory, can be done. It depends how long it lasts. It depends, and of course, the big question is the price, the cost. But to dismantle any group's hold on a statelet is possible. That is a military goal that is possible. The question is the cost, and it is already enormous.
Another question is, would you talk more about Saudi Arabia's role in this issue, and specifically what was the solution for Palestine in the possible Saudi-Israel normalization agreements that did not come to pass?
So Saudi Arabia is a very complicated player here. It's, of course, an extremely important country, mostly because of its wealth and because it is home to the 2 holiest sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina. Saudi Arabia in the distant past was actually quite supportive of Hamas, but has not been in many years now, where Hamas got much more support from Qatar and Iran to rivals of Saudi Arabia. Iran, almost an enemy of Saudi Arabia. And more broadly, Saudi Arabia is extremely hostile to Muslim Brotherhood organizations, including Hamas. Saudi Arabia, however, is not keenly interested in the details of the Palestinian issue by and large. These are broad strokes, but in the past, certainly, America has often wanted Saudi Arabia to play a constructive role in Camp David, for example, in 2000, to come and help the Palestinians make historical compromises, especially as it relates to Jerusalem. Saudis have never been too interested in getting in the weeds there. They would like to play good with everyone, certainly with Palestine and the idea of Palestine, but they have not usually gotten into the weeds. The decision by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, who's the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, to at least explore normalization with Israel, was a strategic one and was not based on the calculations of the Palestinians. It was not about the Palestinian issue at all. It was about Saudi interests, just like the Emirati decision was an Emirati decision. He was mostly after things from the United States Two in particular is a defense pact, perhaps a formal defense treaty with the United States of some kind. And second, a civilian nuclear program in Saudi Arabia that the Americans would support in some way, and many people, including in Israel, fear could one day morph into a military one. Now the question on the table, literally, as October 7th arrived, was what would be a Palestinian component. The Emiratis were, for them, they were satisfied to just have postponing indefinitely, or not even indefinitely, of Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank under the Trump plan, let's call it. The Saudis would have wanted more, but probably not an enormous amount. Not a solution, certainly, to the Palestinian issue. It would probably have looked like strengthening the Palestinian Authority, maybe granting it more territory, although this Israeli coalition would never do that. Probably funding the Palestinian Authority, trying to reform it. Now, suddenly, there are avenues for something else. Now there's a need for something completely different that is well short of a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or Palestinian independence, but would probably include at least verbal commitment to the idea of Palestinian independence and a two-state solution, and hopefully some kind of rebuilding of the Gaza Strip. I just want to make clear, I'm not predicting that tomorrow, certainly not tomorrow, anytime soon this is all happening. I'm just saying this is at least an avenue that one might explore, and there are parties here that are sort of in favor of it. There are also serious reservations that many people have, especially in the United States, about the idea of a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, for example, or a civilian nuclear program. There are many reservations. And also the timeline is difficult. Israeli politics have to figure themselves out first. America's in an election year as of today. And so there are a lot of moving parts that have to settle, but at least in theory, this could be an avenue.
This question goes back to Israeli politics. You mentioned that Benny Gantz is currently the most popular politician, but what do you expect to see in the next elections in terms of the strength of the various political parties? Do you expect a rightward swing among the electorate?
So Benny Gantz, most popular to be prime minister. It's not that he's, not the population is sort of going after him and, seeing him as some kind of messiah. That's not his style at all. In fact, to a certain degree, he represents for Israelis a safe center. He in fact started his political campaign, first of all, saying very little, which was taking advantage of his aura as a former chief of staff, which is usually a very popular position. Security person, civil servant, public servant, not civil, but public servant, honorable kind of man. He's good looking, he's very tall, he speaks well, but he doesn't come across as brilliant, or super charismatic. He comes across as good centers, kind of, we can trust this kind of Israeli kind of type. And that's what he offers today too. He, for example, is more popular than Yair Lapid, slightly to the left of him, partly because he did sit with Netanyahu. He's not someone who shunned the Netanyahu kind of base. He was willing to compromise even with Netanyahu, which lost him enormous support at the time among his own base, but now has come around to be sort of acceptable to the right, acceptable to the left, where Israelis have a strong centripetal move to them. They're looking for a safe center. They're not rallying around the Netanyahu flag, but they are rallying tremendously around the Israeli flag, around an idea of we are in this together. These words of together, we will win together. These are literally headlines you can see in the Israeli press. Some of the papers now, they have a constant sort of headline at the top. We will win together. And Gantz sort of personifies that to a certain degree. Now, right now he's winning big in the polls, but that's without some parties joining. In particular, Naftali Bennett is not in the current Knesset. He'll probably, almost certainly, will head a new party or an old party back into the Knesset, and then he'll take most of the seats from Gantz. These are people who already left Netanyahu, who are right-wing, like Bennett, found a home with Gantz, but it's sort of rented, right? They don't own a home there. And they will probably go with him. Former head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, will probably join politics. We don't know in what configuration. He probably has some support, actually from Likud maybe. He would take not only from Gantz, but maybe from Bibi. All this is speculation, right? This is what it looks like right now in the polls, and it could change quite dramatically over time. We don't know when elections are. They're only scheduled for 3 years from now. Netanyahu, without Gantz in the coalition, still has a clear majority. And part of Gantz's own faction also joined with him and may stay even if he leaves this coalition. So Netanyahu may have a cushion. He may be able to postpone elections for a while. As I said before, procrastination is his strategic move. That's what he does best. Sometimes for better, often for worse. And so I don't know when elections are, and that could change the polls. But there was a question there, would the electorate move right? This is a very important question. I think it's a deeper one. The electorate has moved dramatically to the right in terms of what it thinks about compromise of the Palestinians, especially as it relates to anything to do with security. So Israelis who were Peace Now demonstrators, friends of mine, say, look, in my lifetime, I am not trusting them with a penknife. They're not getting 1 inch of land from which to do that again. None of them. Forget it. We thought we give them territory, they'll search for peace. We gave them the Gaza Strip. We got a nightmare we will not contemplate again, ever. So forget it. That's the mood, and that's for many people who used to be on the left. Now, that's not the same thing as being right-wing on settlements or the land of Israel, or that there should be a one Jewish state from the river to the sea. That's a different thing. And to my mind, one of the policy goals that I think we should have, or the US should have, is to drive a wedge exactly between those two things. This fundamental existential fear is, I'm sorry to say, not unfounded. But, and a lot of the considerations we had before about a two-state solution moving forward, we have to be very skeptical about it, at least because the Israelis are not willing to contemplate it, but also because perhaps they have a point. That does not mean that you revert to more settlements and creating a one-state reality which institutionalizes the problem. Instead, I think you should still strive for independence and political separation, even if it does not include a security element right now. But an enhanced civilian authority for the Palestinian Authority, for example, would be a very different thing. It's still a tall order with Israelis, but I don't think it's impossible. So they've moved very much to the right on security. On settlements, remains to be seen. The median Israeli voter is not in love with settlements, to say the least, but is open to it. And moreover, in terms of the personalities and the parties, they have actually moved to the center, as I said before, right? Because they see Benny Gantz not as some naive lefty who says, let's be nice to the Palestinians and everything will be okay, in the Israeli psyche, right? But rather, hard-nosed security type, but pragmatic and not nearly as divisive as Netanyahu. That's a key point.
I think we have time for one more question, which is actually sort of two. You touched on this a little, but I'll ask it in this sharper way. Should a left-leaning Zionist still aspire for a two-state solution? And this person's second question is for recommendations of sources of news for English-speaking Americans.
Not Twitter. Should a left-leaning Zionist? Yes. Partly because, but I'll caveat that in two ways. First, I'll preface my caveat. You have to have a serious policy goal, otherwise you have no idea if the steps you're taking along the way are leading in the right direction. And the appropriate policy goal, let's leave aside the phrase two-state solution because it's become so tired and even demonized, okay? I'll say it in other words, and we'll see if that's tired and demonized. Dignity and political independence for all the peoples involved, and in particular the Palestinian and Israeli people, okay? If you object to that, I disagree with you, and I do think that's the proper goal. Does that mean that I think that tomorrow we should restart the peace process and convene a conference that says, how do we, let's see, the 3% that we were talking about near Kalkilia, should they move left or right? No. We're in a very different chapter to that, on the Israeli side, but also on the Palestinian side, by the way. And therefore, I don't recommend jumping back into the two-state kind of where we were. It's not the 1990s. It hasn't been for a long time. And it's really time we catch up to that. Secondly, where I feel far more vehemently, if these events made us more skeptical of the possibility of reconciliation through a two-state solution, they should make us tenfold more skeptical of any, not naive, reckless ideas of one-state nonsense. And that is because the one-state nonsense assumes that these same extremists, all of them, Yahya Sinwar of Hamas, he might be the chief of police, say, in the neighborhood where my mom lives. How about that? Right? That's the Peter Beinart, I'm sorry to criticize him in abstention, but that's what they say. Never mind, I shouldn't target individuals. That's what all sorts of people who propose a one-state solution say, is like, perhaps let's have a one state, but there won't be a problem, they say. Why? Because we'll solve the problem, the one problem, which is inequality, which is the occupation. Not only occupation, inequality writ large. I happen to be very strongly against the occupation and for equality. But let me tell you some news. If Yahya Sinwar or anyone else from Hamas is going to be the chief of police in my mom's neighborhood, everyone I know in Israel will take up arms to stop that, certainly after October 7th, but by the way, long before. And if an Jewish Israeli would take up arms to stop that from happening, well, guess what the Palestinian would do? They would take up arms to stop the taking up of arms. That's called an ethnic security dilemma. And all these people who think that the only problem is inequity, and if you solve that, you get peace, they are worse than naive. They are either disingenuous or reckless, because the problems here are manifold. They are also inequity. They are also two very conflicting national movements that have a conflict. It's not just one oppressor and one oppressed. There are also religious movements here. Hamas's motivations are not just nationalist. They're not about the occupation, certainly. That's why they crossed the Green Line, or not the Green Line. That's why they crossed into Israel, because that is Palestine too, from the river to the sea. And solving all of this with something you cooked up in a conference in Brooklyn is worse than naive. It is absolutely reckless. And after October 7th, it is also nonsense. It is just non-starter. And therefore, yes, two-state solutions or the idea of independence at some point in some form must be our goal. However, here's my big qualification. That does not mean we're acting upon it today. It means that we need to reorient everything we're doing, even if we're only managing the conflict right now, towards that, towards greater dignity, greater independence, greater autonomy. If we can't do it on security now or for quite a while, then we do it on everything else in a meaningful way. It means we don't allow settlements to grow. We stop settler violence in a meaningful way with actual force behind it. It means we allow the Palestinian Authority not just to have something here that Israelis will permit today, but actual authority to zone, to plan, to build, real contiguity between their territories on civilian affairs at least. Even if you take completely seriously what I just described about the ethnic security dilemma and Israel's unwillingness to contemplate Palestinian threats to them. Because Gaza borders one part of Israel. The West Bank borders much, much more of Israel. So in short, yes. Sources, Brookings, that you know. The Times of Israel, I think, is very good. Haaretz.com gives you a good view of left and even very, very left Israelis. I like Haaretz.com, and I know many of the writers, but I'll just qualify. What you read there is very lefty Israeli. Okay, it does not come close to the Israeli mainstream at all. At all. Certainly in English. In Hebrew it doesn't. In English, much less so. Times of Israel is much closer to the Israeli center, sometimes center-left, but that's kind of a very centrist view. Ynet News is the English version of the most popular Israeli news source, Ynet, which is actually Yediot Achronot, a newspaper, or one of the two most popular. And then if you want a view of right-wing Israeli, then Israel Hayom, which is Israel Today, I think in English. I think they just translated Israel Today. I mean, that is the translation. I think that's also the website. Israel Today would be sort of a right-wing, used to be very pro-Netanyahu. It's not anymore. Edelson died, his wife, things happen. So it's right-wing, but it's not necessarily pro-Netanyahu. Those, I think, would be a variety of sources. So Haaretz.com will often give you a lot of quality, but really, you need to understand you're reading their quality stuff often, very, like 3 orders of magnitude left of the Israeli center. Ynet News is kind of centrist. Times of Israel, which is only in English mostly, is centrist. And Israel Today is sort of center-right or sometimes very right.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was really, really so informative. Thank you. And I will turn things back over to Russ, I think, for
Russ.
an announcement.
Thanks, Russ.
Quick announcement. We're going to have refreshments. Please roam around. A chance to talk more with Natan. Because the NIF is the reason why we have been able to get Natan here, those of you who are NIF donors and a few others, I've invited you to a small reception in the small sanctuary, and we'll gather there. You can bring refreshments at 4:45. Everyone else, if you want to chat with Natan until then, that's great. So refreshments are there, and those who received an invitation at 4:45. And thank you at the end for your passionate comments about One Israel.
Thanks.
Many of us hadn't heard that, and it's sometimes helpful to take away the analysis and just talk from the heart, which I think you did. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Russ. Thanks again. Thank you all. Thank you, Rabbi.
Very cool. Thank you.